So, thank you, Wayne. You haven't been here for the other instructions, so just to let you know, you have 10 minutes to present. You'll have a bell at 9 minutes and a double bell at 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ladies and gentlemen of the council, look, I do apologise for being so late. It's quite a challenge to use these taxis, trust me.
Does that pull out further, that stalk on the thing?
So you might be right.
I can hear him.
Thanks, thank you, Richard.
Okay, hang on. Let me get this gear ready. Thank you for waiting. That's it. Right. Could you give me that? Pop it down there. I wish. Can you hear me okay? Or?
Yep, I can.
Thank you for the opportunity to make a submission, and I do apologise for holding you up like that. Thank you. No problem. Thank you for waiting. I wish to appeal to that side of the council which subscribes to common sense, good governorship, sound judgment and fair play. A decision in favour of Easter trading has been settled once already, and as a direct consequence of that, 2 open Easter shopping events have passed without the slightest incidents whatsoever. As expected, no apocalypse, no Armageddon, nothing. Conversely, in fact, many families got out in the sun and engaged themselves in what is apparently the most popular of all Kiwi family pastimes, shopping. Shame on them. Without any other corroborative evidence, this alone provides ample endorsement, in my view, of the public acceptability of Council's previous decision. It also endorses the simple fact that the average Joe citizen is far better placed to make his own decisions regarding what is best for him, as opposed to a cult to which he doesn't even subscribe nor has any desire to. In a sense, what we have here is a contemporary example of the difference between the heavy-handed, no-prisoners approach of dictatorship politics, i.e. the church, versus the more moderate, people-friendly approach of democratic, secular-based, open society model. Why central government could not simply have legislated in favour in the first place and saved us all this unnecessary trouble will remain the most perplexing question of all, but in all probability rests with the unsatisfactoriness of secularly elected parliamentary representatives still caught with a leg on both sides of the so-called value spectrum. I actually had an experience of that with this council, a person here who I voted for at the last election on the basis that I was quite certain that he would vote the way I was hoping he would, and it turned out he didn't, so just shows you, I got a bit of a surprise.
But only decision.
But what of the indomitable Mr. Gwynn, who has attempted to prise open an imaginary social divide amongst the otherwise disinterested citizens of Napier? Mr. Gwynn requires Council to stop the calendrical clock around 600 CE, that's 1400 years ago, which is the approximate date that his church arbitrarily expropriated the centuries-old former spring or spring growth festival, Eostra, incorporating the festival into their liturgy under the new title of Easter. What I'm trying to say here is that Easter has really got little to do with what they're claiming it has. Ostensibly to prevent us from shopping, presumably because the noise from the said activities interrupt his need for religious sustenance. Such intolerance towards one fellow citizens. Mr Gwyn's overt hostility towards Napier ratepayers is even more remarkable given that his church receives the largest financial handout of any church operating by means of rates exemptions. It seems eminently reasonable, even to myself, to inquire of the devoutly religious that I presume were seated here earlier, and they've listed their names on their submissions: Gwyn, Collingwood, Ian Render, Ruth Smithies, Phil Henderson, Arthur Tulligan, Noel Henry and the Reverend Tony Ross, who have provided written testimony as to the religious significance of Easter to them. Just why, in that case, neither the term nor the event appears anywhere in the pages of their sacred text, the Bible. I would have expected it to be there, given the hoo-ha and the nonsense that they purport to be affected by. I can readily testify to the fact that the events are fictions, which are entirely and only within the narrow perimeters of their religiously stunted minds. I do feel quite sorry for Mr Gwyn. His confusion, the one-dimensionally false path down which his faith has led him, causing an inability to determine historical fact from religious fiction, which raises a pivotal question for council in my view. Should a religious belief, no matter how sincerely held, be sufficient to cause council to deviate from its lawfully established goal, indeed to undermine the evidential basis within which council is constrained to act? And I also wonder if Mr Gwyn would have exercised his secular right to appeal had the earlier decision gone in his favour. Now, you're going to say to yourself, well, of course it wouldn't, because he lost, therefore that's the only reason he would appeal. But I ask you to think about that. The circumstances surrounding the basis of the last meeting where the decision was made were identical to this. Absolutely identical. Mr Gwyn, of course, would argue with that, but in fact they were. Apart from a few people that were perhaps not. And in other words, the process was adequate for a win, but inadequate when he lost. Accordingly, it seems realistic to conclude that Mr Gwyn's action was perhaps driven more by the outcome than any minor mistake committed by council. Neither do his alleged Christian concerns for family matters add up. They're certainly not corroborated by historical facts. In my view, and okay, I have a fairly fixed view myself, in my view, the Christian church has little to argue in favour of family or family values, given their history, which includes the Holocaust. I doubt if there's any Jews in the room, I doubt if they would agree with Mr Gwyn on that point, in which over 6 million Jews were murdered, over half of which were women and children. No, council's original decision was indeed the correct one, the only one, and I respectfully submit that it remains unchanged. We all want a prosperous, progressive city which treats its citizens properly, and it's the duty of Napier City Council to treat those within its jurisdiction equally. I'm confident that NCC will do what must be done. Look, just before I go, there's one other point I would like to make, and that's regarding holidays. Last week, a Dominion correspondent bemoaned the lack of holidays in New Zealand. Cambodia, for example, has 28 public holidays, Finland 15. Allegedly in New Zealand, we've got 11. But I would argue we've only actually got 8.5 because of the restrictions on those 2.5 other holidays. A holiday by definition can't be a holiday if its most significant point is how many restrictions it's got, what you can't do, rather than what you can. That applies right across the board.
You got 1 minute, Wayne. Would you prefer to take some questions, or have you got something else to...
No, that'll do for now. Thank you very much for listening.
Right, any questions of Wayne? Somewhat a different tack than we've heard this morning.
I felt that was justified, given that, in fact, you, Mr Mayor, commented to me about the case being the appeal being Gwyn versus Napier City Council, and he based it, given the evidence he's provided in the main submission there, he's based it on religious grounds.
I don't remember ever saying that, but in fact that's a matter of record.
I can show you on record where it is, if you want me to.
Yeah. So no questions? No, thank you very much, Wayne, for that submission.
And thank you for your time.
So, councillors, we have a motion on the table, and you're all aware of it. The officer's recommendation is to receive, consider and hear where requested submissions on the proposed Easter Sunday trading policy. We've done that. And then following consideration of submissions, Council adopts the Easter Sunday Trading Policy 2018 to allow shops to trade on Easter Sunday in the Napier District. Now, what we need to do is now discuss what we've heard this morning, and I now open the floor for discussion.
Is it moved and seconded and discussed, or?
It's moved and seconded.
Okay, so the mover should speak.
So I now open the floor for discussion.
Are there any questions first?
Or discussion or questions, I don't mind.
All right, could you just explain, is this moved and seconded and now we're speaking once to this resolution? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, thank you.
Okay, through the chair, thank you. We all know that this has not been an easy decision, because we've, in the past, probably had half of our population for and vice versa. So, and I am one of those people that does have a religious background. I was brought up as a Catholic, so I have been brought up as in the church, and I have a lot of history, and I'm still consider that Easter Sunday is a religious day, and I have a choice whether I attend church on that day, and I do. So, but what I really feel today is that many of our people in our community choose not to attend or observe it as a Christian holiday, and that's their prerogative. And I believe they still have a choice, because they still have a choice. But anyway, the critical points for me today, which I think we have to be, we've been taught to, is about the fabric of family. And I'm a mother. I have 4 children. Family is probably the thing that is most important to me. And so I think today we've heard from the Samoan Church, we've heard from the churches about their congregations. We don't have to water down that. We can keep that. We can go to church. We can spend time with our families. We have choices, and no one wants to unravel that. Everyone wants to keep families and the fabric of families and whānau together to be able to celebrate those times. And I don't think it would be the intention of any councillor around the table to destroy that fabric in our community, because it's important. It's the heart of what we do. But what I feel today comes down to is it's the CBD retailers who are the key people we should be listening to today. They must be allowed to make a choice. They should not be mandated by other groups, the retailers don't mandate to them. So I think for me that is probably quite key. We also know that tourism is the lifeblood of our city, and given that Easter falls at a time of peak tourism when the school holidays and many events are being held in our city, the retailers need to have the choice to maximise their opportunities to trade with these visitors. In some cases, it may be the difference between staying in business as many struggle through the winter months and also from the effects of online shopping. It's not easy to be a retailer in the current world. It's also important to note that 2/3 of our CBD retailers have indicated their preference to trade, and we should allow them that opportunity. The opening of shops on Easter Sunday in the CBD will not be mandatory. Today's decision also allows our retailers a choice to open for business or remain closed. I believe they deserve the freedom of choice. Thank you.
Right, any other comments? Councillor Tapley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been an interesting journey this morning. As with the last time this was brought to the table, I was undecided when the vote hit the table. We had a preference towards one option, but by the end of the deliberations and submissions at the last round, I had shifted my position based on the submissions that were made. Seems the same thing has happened again internally for me today. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with regards to my interpretation of the submissions from our city. So just like as Councillor White has indicated, I myself come from a heavily religious background. My mother, as a Māori, we celebrate spiritual activities and practices just about in everything from breathing in to drinking water to engaging in a conversation. Within the valley where I was brought up, we have a strong affiliation with the Ringatu faith. My grandmother was a staunch Catholic, and I remember vividly walking around town posting up posters of repent and come to church, such types of whakaaro. And I myself have spent a number of years travelling around New Zealand speaking on a itinerant basis, being invited to elaborate on various passages of the Bible. So given this heavy religious background, it was been particularly challenging for me to remain unbiased and free and open-minded as I entered into this kōrero with Council. But religious and cultural ceremonies are the manifestations and expressions of the practices and traditions that people have with their connected faith or belief. We all have many of our own faiths and beliefs, and they're varied like the hues of the sunset. But my ability to choose or to actualise or to participate or to give effect to my belief, just as Councillor White has indicated, that choice is connected to my conviction. If I choose to participate in a religious activity, I do so because it's a priority for myself, not because it's endorsed by a bylaw or because there's legislative ability for me to do so. Instead, it is directly connected to my conviction on the matter at the time. Whether or not we pass a policy or whether or not we agree with the law does not diminish my ability to exercise that choice. And by the reverse of that, it also does not limit a retailer in the absence of a policy or this legislation to make that same choice. If I owned a business, I could choose to close for the day if my religious convictions required me to do so. And there is nothing preventing me from doing that. So the choices are equal on both sides of the table. Since the first missionaries arrived and the Marist priests arrived, here in Aotearoa, the Catholic faith and European faiths have been heavily dominant in the formation of our cultural practices and our laws which have governed the way that we operate. And as a result of change and evolving times, such things as economic drivers have started to provide more pressure around how we might interpret our faith in a commercially active space. Some of which have evolved, some haven't. These traditional values and practices are still active and are being practiced today. They are recognised by how they influence the way we spend our weekends. Shopping, various commercial activities diminish over Saturday and Sunday, and in some cases there's almost no activity on a Sunday in some parts of the country. So that lends back to the credence that as a retailer or an employer, you still have the right to exercise your own personal choice in the matter. So when I came into the deliberations today, I was pretty sure that I wanted to make sure that I recognised the complex history that our country had, which has formed some of those values that we share at this table, regardless of our religious position. And I have to say, it's been a challenging corridor to listen to this morning as I've bounced backwards and forwards. I guess that's the whole point of not being predetermined. As far as being Māori is concerned, spirituality is connected to well-being, as is the strength of your family unit. And we state within our city policy and practices that, yes, we want to create a vibrant economy where we encourage tourists to come and participate in what we have to offer here in our region. But also, we talk about putting people first and creating a space where, as a resident within the city, you have the right to linger and last in spaces regardless of what your religious conviction is. So I think those options are still available to us. Tourism is projected to grow. It will continue to grow. The port's just going through a $350 million decision at the moment to help facilitate that growth. So regardless of whether we enforce a policy or we reinforce the legislation, we're going to get an increase in tourism numbers in our region. And that is at the core of what the city has been driving to do.
Excuse me, Councillor Tuppy, can you just wind it up a little bit, please?
Wind it up a little bit best as I
Tell
can.
us whether you're for or against it.
He's not sure yet.
I'm not sure yet, actually, as I'm going through this. I'm not sure. So, I mean, I've weighted that religious background to say I should jump into that pot, but actually I recognise that the risk of this decision is not carried ultimately by me, but by our retailers who take out heavy leveraging situations in order to provide those employment opportunities and services to our residents. So there's a huge desire for me to see us support them in that space. And while I recognise that the policy might empower them to do that, I also am concerned, as was expressed earlier on, that those who are most vulnerable in this situation are our casual and part-time employees who don't actually have the same choice as those who are on permanent and full-time contracts. And the pressure upon them to provide for their families and to meet their growing costs is significant. And they don't really feel they have a choice, but rather that they're obliged to take those hours or there will be formal or informal sanctions. So it's been a tricky one. In the end, I actually would prefer to see the legislation remain and no policy put in place for those reasons, but also primarily because there are not many opportunities as councillors where we get the chance to reinforce a policy or legislation which allows us to invest socially in our communities. And for me, that's really where this decision has been lying today. I get the religious viewpoint, I get the need to meet economic drivers. However, with only 3.5 days in the year where you can plan, absolutely, to spend time with those that matter most to you, this opportunity and this before us today provides us with an opportunity to actually invest in the social capital of our city. The family unit is at the core of a stable community and is at the core of a vibrant community and a thriving city. We don't have many opportunities.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just say I accept you're very passionate about the subject. Our standing orders give us 5 minutes to speak.
Do you want to start now?
You've actually just finished your second 5 minutes.
Oh, excellent.
And so really what we would like you to do is to summarise exactly where you stand and whether you're speaking